makes time for everybody. I mean, Joyce was at my wedding. She has always followed up with my boys. And I had a backyard wedding at my aunt's house in Teaneck, New Jersey. And so she's never, regardless of the success that she's achieved, forgotten to bring others along and encourage others. And that's something that I have modeled because of her and other mentors. So I really appreciate that. Of all the amazing things you've done, Joyce, that you're there for others. Joyce Roche is a marketing executive and nonprofit executive. She was born and raised in Louisiana. She earned her BA degree in math education from Dillard University and an MBA degree in marketing from Columbia University. Following her graduation from Columbia, she began working as a manager of merchandising at Avon Products, Inc., left Avon to work as the director of marketing at Revlon, Inc. She returned to Avon, where she served as the first female African-American vice president and its first vice president of global marketing. Roche went on to work at Carson Products, Inc., where she served as executive vice president of marketing and was then promoted to president and chief operations officer. In 2000, Joyce became the president and chief executive officer of Girls Incorporated. I had the pleasure to work under Joyce's leadership and to learn from her in that capacity as well. Joyce has served on numerous corporate boards, including AT&T, Tupperware Brands Corporation, and she later joined the boards of Anheuser-Busch Companies, Macy's Inc., and Dr. Pepper Snapple Group. Joyce was the recipient of the Business Achievement Award from the Black Retail Action Group, the Legacy Award from Black Career Women, the Distinguished Community Leadership Award from Bronx Community College, go Boogie Down, the Presidential Medal of Honor from Dillard University, among many other accolades. She has also been named one of the 21 Women of Power and Influence in Corporate America by Black Enterprise Magazine and one of the top 50 women in business by Business Week, as well as many other nominations, awards, and accolades. She received an honorary doctor from Dillard University, North Adams State College, Bryant University, Mercy College, and Old Dominion University. In 2013, she published the business memoir titled The Empress Has No Clothes, Conquering Self-Doubt to Embrace Success, which is going to be the basis of today's discussion. And I am honored that I was one of the individuals that had a chance to vote for the title. I remember when you sent that email, gave us a couple of options and we got to vote for it. So a little bit of that. So Joyce, we're going to give you the floor and a big chunk of time to just talk. Everybody wants to hear you and we're excited. So please take the floor.
Well, Damari, thank you very much. And thank you and Constance and Marietta for this invitation. It's just wonderful to be here. And I also have to just thank all of our participants because this is a subject that a lot of people find very difficult to talk about. And so it's remained in the shadows for much too long. So I applaud all of you for taking time today to talk a little bit about this. And I will take some time, leave some time at the end for some questions as well, because you may have questions once I'm done. But I just wanted to give you an overview of this subject because for me, it was such an incredible aha because it was something that I personally dealt with for so much of my career and never knew that it was something that actually had been researched and that a lot of people deal with it. First, for those of you who are not familiar with the imposter syndrome, the imposter syndrome is that self-doubt which comes to bear when you think that for whatever reason, because you're in an environment that you're different from the majority of the people that you're in within this particular environment, that you question your abilities, you question whether you're good enough, you question whether you're smart enough, and you think that others will find out that you're not up to snuff. So I learned about the imposter syndrome back in 2005 and learned, I was approached by Ellen Spraggan, the Fortune small business writer, who was doing a book called What I Know Now, Letters to My Younger Self. And in that book, she invited 30 women from very different walks of life. I was at Girls Inc. then, but she had people like Eileen Fisher, who's a designer, Madeleine Albright, who used to be Secretary of State, Queen Noor, Shannon Miller, who was gymnast, Felicia Richard, so people from a lot of different walks of life. And she asked this question of everybody. She said, if you could speak with your 30-year-old self with the knowledge that you have today, what would you say? And that really took me aback because I hadn't really internalized or ever given voice to these feelings that I had so much of my professional career. And in this letter, I actually gave voice to what I had been feeling for most of my career. And I'm going to share a little bit of the letter with you. It starts out like this. Dear Joyce, you may not have set out to be a pioneer, but here you are, out front, one of the few African-American women working up the corporate ladder. You achieve more every year, but each leap exerts more pressure. Who would have thought that success could feel so much like a burden? I go on to say, you're not complaining because strangely there's a giddiness to such hard work. You risk a lot every time you seize an opportunity that's presented itself. Laboring more intensely shows you're worthy of the chances you've been given. It also props open the door for every African-American woman who might be coming up behind you. Well, this is what you tell yourself, and it's all true, but it only goes so far. Ever wonder why the glow wears off so soon? I went on to say that the threat of failure scares you into these long hours, yet success only intensifies the fear of discovery. At the end of my letter, I say this, stop it now. You're not an imposter. You're the genuine article. You have the brain power, you have the ability, you don't have to work so hard and worry so much. You're going to do just fine. You deserve a place at the table. Well, when I did that letter and Ellen's book came out, we at Girls Inc. actually did an event for Ellen, and I was on a panel with Eileen Fisher and Shannon Miller. And we talked about our letters. And in the audience, someone asked the question, she said, when did you identify that you have the imposter syndrome? Well, I'd never heard the term. I didn't know what she was talking about. But I looked it up and I found out it was something that had actually been researched by two psychotherapists, Dr. Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, in the late 70s. And they did research with 100 highly successful women who the evidence in terms of their credentials, they had PhDs, et cetera, but they didn't feel that they were qualified, quote unquote, for the positions they were in. And so they had this self-doubt that they were going to be found out, that they weren't smart enough, they weren't experienced enough, and therefore they would be a failure. Well, they termed this the imposter syndrome. And that term is what this person was describing and what actually I was describing in my letter. I learned another thing though after Ellen's book came out, and when I decided after I left Girls Inc., which I decided to do my book in 2013, or I restarted on in 2011, I learned that I was not alone, which also blew me away. When Ellen's book came out, there were 3 letters that were reprinted in O Magazine, and mine was one of the 3 letters. And when that came out, I got letters and emails and from people, many of whom I didn't know. And all they said was, oh my God, you're telling my story, you need to do a book. And that's when the kind of aha came to me, well, maybe I'm not the only one that had these feelings. The other thing that happened was that when that article came out, and as Damari said, that I've been lucky and honored to serve on a number of corporate boards, and I was on the AT&T board then, and the CEO, who's since retired, Ed Whitaker, he was in place at that point, and they passed around the article from the old magazine, which had my letter in it, and Ed was the first one who said to me, Joyce, this isn't just something that women deal with. I've dealt with this my entire career. Well, that blew me away. I mean, one, here was this extremely successful white male, big guy, talking about he had the imposter syndrome. So that was really, that was an incredible aha. And in fact, in my book, when I got ready to do the book, I reached out to Ed because I wanted people to know a message. That doesn't mean you're not going to be successful if you're dealing with this. And he agreed to do the foreword for the book. But I'm getting a little bit ahead. One other thing, though, I've noticed since my book has been out, and you've probably noticed, because now the imposter syndrome seems to be a term that people are hearing more, and they're discussing more, which is great, and I take credit for that. Really, no, not honestly. But it's fun to see it being discussed because it has been in the shadows. But there were two articles that I want to just share with you that talked about this, that struck me as I started seeing more and more articles on this. One was an interview that Viola Davis did, which she was talking about filming the movie Doubt with Meryl Streep and Philip Seymour Hoffman. And she said that the three actors shared their common insecurities. And she went on to say, with every new job, you worry that you'll be found out as the hack that you are. She said, this will be the big failure that takes you down. She says that fear is an occupational hazard. It drives you to perfectionism, which you'll never achieve anyway. Then when Michelle Obama's book came out, Our First Lady, and in her book tour, this article came as she was talking, she was doing her tours around the country, and she made the comment, I still have a little imposter syndrome. It doesn't go away. That feeling that you shouldn't take me that seriously. What do I know? I share that with you because we all have doubts in our abilities, about our power and what that power is. She went on to say that young women have to push the demons out of our head because it is this voice that's in your head that constantly gives you those messages. She said, revealing that too much, ask yourself, is she good enough? Obama noted that women internalize this self-doubt from an early age, adding that this feeling is especially prevalent among women of color. So those are just some of the things that have been bubbling up, but it still is something that, as I've been speaking around the country since my book was issued and published in 2013, that I feel that people still really want to talk about, but haven't been given the license to talk about. So my reason for doing my book, excuse me, was because I wanted to give voice to this, and I wanted people to know that comment that you will, it doesn't mean you won't be successful, and it doesn't mean that other people, in fact, I reached out to Dr. Clance, who was one of the researchers who did her research on the imposter syndrome, and asked if I could ask her some questions about it. And she went on to say, excuse me, I should have brought some water in. She went on to say that this is something that the majority of people, especially successful people, deal with. So as I learned that, and as I decided to do my book, I decided I would reach out to some other people and see if I could get stories from them, people that I knew, people who were successful, but also dealt with this. And I wanted it to be women as well as men. So I didn't want it to be something that just women dealt with. And I wanted it to be people of color and Caucasians as well. I'm going to just take 1 second to get some water. Okay, I'm back. So I reached out to people that I knew, as I said, and told them that I was doing this book. And if they said, oh my gosh, I've dealt with that, I deal with that, I would ask, would you be willing to be in the book? So as you can see, I was very selective. No, really, I was selective in terms of the people I asked, but I wanted those stories to be in there. So Debbie Lee, who is now the retired CEO of BET, has a story in there. Val Ackerman, who was the president of the WNBA, the first president of the WNBA. Eileen Fisher, who I'd gotten to know from Ellen's book, agreed to do a story. Rick Goings, who was the CEO of Tupperware, I've got a story from him. So a lot of different people from a lot of different aspects. I asked. And when they agreed to do to give me a story, I wanted to find out from them a little bit about them, because what I realized is I was discovering my own journey and trying to understand, where did this thing come from? And as I talked to people about how they grew up, where did they, about their parents, did their parents go to college, et cetera, I learned something very interesting, that there are triggers to this thing called the imposter syndrome. And those triggers happen whenever you are different. And what I mean by that is, a woman in a predominantly male environment, that will be a trigger for her, because she thinks that the men are thinking that she's probably doesn't have this kind of experience that they have, that she's probably not a good leader, that she probably just isn't ready for this particular job. So what does she do? She works like crazy to counter what she thinks they're thinking about her. A person of color, absolutely, that will be a trigger if you're in a majority environment. A person of color in a majority environment happened to me very clearly when I went to Columbia. You're in an environment where, in fact, you're different from the majority of the people in that majority who don't look like you. And so what do you think? You think that they're thinking, well, she probably doesn't have a really good educational background. She probably doesn't have relevant experience. She probably doesn't quite know how to fit in, et cetera, et cetera. So what do? You work like crazy to counter what you think they're thinking about you. So I asked myself, as I mentioned, Ed Whittaker is a white male, Rick Goings is a white male, what could be their triggers? And I found out that theirs was, they grew up in a family with limited economic means, and they had parents who didn't go to college. So for them, they were climbing up this ladder, and then all of a sudden their peer group became all of these people who they thought came up in families who had a lot of money, who went to the best schools, whose parents went to college, and they wondered if they were accepted and acceptable in that group. So that became their triggers. So it can be anything when you're different. So actually I asked Dr. Clance that question when this started to surface for me as I talked to people, and she said, absolutely, that is it, because the imposter syndrome is an emotional reaction to what may or may not be happening. And that's important to understand, because often what happens, because you're different, you think it, so that's where the emotional reaction of you thinking what people are thinking about you and how they're assessing you. But sometimes actually it's not the imposter syndrome, and it's an environment that you're in that is not accepting of difference. And so they're sending you this message, either overtly or covertly, that you don't fit. And it's important to understand the difference. But often the imposter syndrome is this emotional reaction to what is happening, what you feel is happening. I'm going to share just a little bit of a couple of stories that will help dimensionalize these dynamics. I mentioned that when I went to Columbia, that's when I really got a big dose of the imposter syndrome, because I had never been in an environment where I was competing against or working with people who didn't look like me. I went to public school in New Orleans. I went to a historically Black college, and all of a sudden I find myself at Columbia, and there are like a handful of us there. The majority of, I think it was less than 1% of us were African Americans. So the majority of the people there were Caucasian, either from the US or international. And it really did cause me to question whether or not I could cut it, whether or not I would be able to compete effectively. And so what did I do? I kind of kept my head down, didn't speak up a lot in class for fear that in fact I would be found out that I didn't deserve to be there, that they would find out that somehow I got in there as a fluke. So it caused me to work like crazy and really not enjoy the time, even though I was successful in in completing my MBA and moving into a career that I didn't know existed before I went to Columbia. Well, Debbie Lee, when I talked to her, and she talked about something very similar to her time at Harvard, and she went to Harvard in law school. And she went on, I'm not going to read her whole letter, but she said this about Harvard. She said, Harvard is Harvard, and supposedly only the best and the brightest go there. She said, at Brown, I didn't have a lot of self-doubt, but when I got to Harvard, I was suddenly anxious. I was worried that maybe I didn't really belong, that I was a mistake. I wasn't going to be successful, and I would let my family down, my community down, and my race down. So that is that feeling of being in an environment where you just feel that everybody's questioning whether or not, and then it causes you to feel like you may stumble and not be successful in that environment because you are different. The other story I'm going to share is one that is in a chapter that I call Gender Matters, and that's about a woman in a predominantly male environment. And this was a friend. Her name is Ann Shostak, and she was one of the first women executive vice president at Fleet Bank, and the first woman president of a bank in New England. And she went on to say, I kind of grew up in the bank, and I continued to advance and moving up to the executive vice president of consumer banking and then to the corporate role. She said, even then, I still felt like an outsider. Unlike my male colleagues, I wasn't promoted to be given a chance to live up to my potential. At every step, I felt I had to prove myself in order to advance. She went on to say that my solution was to work harder than ever. I didn't want to let the bank or myself down, but I also didn't want to let other women down or let the bank think that a woman wasn't going to be able to be successful. And that was a pretty heavy load of pressure I wouldn't wish on anybody. So a woman in a predominantly male environment. Now, Rick Goings. Here is someone who economic status was his issue. And he said in here, when I was in my 20s, I started making a lot of money. But I was living in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Charlottesville is a town of old wealth. I didn't have the kind of breeding that comes from growing up around horse horns and coming out balls. I hadn't even finished college, a fact I hid carefully. All I had was a flashy car. He said, although I became a member of the country club, I never felt fully accepted. I knew that people looked down on the business I was in. He said, and having people look at me as a slickster really triggered this sense that I was a fake. I was an imposter. At the end of his letter, he said, yet after all the learnings, the success, the adventures, I'm still plagued by the imposter syndrome from years ago. So those just dimensionalize the different spectrum that these things can take on, and nobody's really immune from them. One of the times, and I want to be cognizant of the time, one of the times that I really realized that I needed to acknowledge my own achievements was when I was at Avon, and Damari mentioned that I went there out of business school, and then I went to Revlon, and then I was recruited back to the company, and I was recruited back with the promise that I would be in line to become a vice president, and there hadn't been anybody who looked like me who had been a vice president of the company. So I went back, and as I worked up, a couple of years, an opening came up, and I said, oh my gosh, this is my opportunity. And before I could even get anxious about it, and my imposter starting up thinking, okay, you got this job, gonna get this new job, are you gonna be able to do anything with it? Before I could get there, however, there became a guy who became the heir apparent, and a white guy. And I'm going, oh my God, I'm being dismissed out of hand without even seemingly being considered. And so, often with the imposter syndrome, we keep ourselves tight. We do our jobs. We do go beyond our jobs. We accomplish, etc. And we always think, okay, that should be enough. Well, sometimes it's not enough. And sometimes you've got to acknowledge your own achievements. And this time it just got to me that, okay, you've got to speak up for yourself. And so I went to my boss and said, well, is this telling me that I'm not in line for this position? And he couldn't really talk to women, and definitely not African-American women. So he said, well, you need to go talk to Alan, who was his boss, who was our executive vice president. So I went to Alan, who had come into the United States from our European office, and I had a good relation with Alan. And I said, is this the message? Am I, is Jim going to get this position? And he said, well, before I answer that, tell me how you compare with Jim and then another white guy whose name was Mike. And we had merchandising. Our marketing organization was broken into two parts, merchandising and product marketing. So I said to him, I said, well, Mike is probably a little stronger in merchandising. Even though I came in the company and grew up under the merchandising umbrella, this guy had spent his whole life in that, and that's what he was doing then. I said, so he may have a little bit of an edge in merchandising, but he has no experience in product marketing. I had done product marketing at Revlon, and then when I came back to Avon, that's where I went. I took over a couple of the businesses, the fragrance business, etc. And so I said, but I can run rings around him from a product standpoint. Then I said, Jim, I brought into the company. I taught him everything he knows. I said, so I know that I'm better than he is. So Alan said, you're absolutely right. He said, but they're just more comfortable with Jim. And I'm thinking, oh my God, comfort. What does comfort have to do with it? I said to him, Alan, I'm a woman and I'm Black. I can't change those two things. But I've accomplished, I've worked hard, I've made strides in this company. I've done, beyond. And I said, so I can't make you guys any more comfortable with me than you ought to be at this stage. Well, the company was a good company who logic played out, and I became a vice president. They made Jim a vice president at the same time, so we split the roles in terms of we had two different parts of the business. But that was okay. So sometimes you have to get to that point of being able to, as I call it, internalize and internalize your own achievements and be able to speak up for yourself. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the title of the book, because it, I think, dimensionalizes the idea of the imposter syndrome. Many of you know the story of the Empress New Clothes. Well, if you don't, I'll give you a quick on the story. The story is that there's this emperor who is reigning of this kingdom, and these two con artists come in and they tell the emperor, we can weave fabric of incredible beauty and quality, but the fabric has this unbelievable magical property in that whoever is stupid and unfit for their post, they won't be able to see it. And so the emperor is saying, oh my gosh, I've got to have this. So he gets the guys, he puts them in a room, and they're pretending, they're con artists, they're not doing anything, they're pretending to weave this fabric. And he sends his ministers down one by one to check on the progress. Well, they go down and they don't see anything because there's really nothing happening. So they come back and they think that, oh my God, I must be stupid and unfit for my post, but I'm not going to tell the emperor that. So they go and tell him, oh, you wouldn't believe how beautiful this fabric is. So finally, the emperor says, well, is the suit done that they're going to make for me? And he says, yeah. They tell him, yes, it's done. So he goes down and he doesn't see anything. So the emperor is definitely not going to say he doesn't see a suit there. So he proceeds to take off his clothes and put on this suit, which is not there, and goes parading in the kingdom. And everybody's whispering, oh my God, he's naked, he's naked. Well, that is the imposter syndrome, dimensionalized. You never want to feel stupid and unfit for your post. So you work like crazy. You over prepare. You never are comfortable because you're afraid that somebody's going to say that you're stupid and unfit for your post. So that's where the title of The Empress Has No Clothes. And as Damari said, when I was doing the book and we did research, many people didn't know at that stage, even, again, this is 2012, the term imposter syndrome, and that's why we called it self-doubt. Because it is that self-doubt that whoever the they is, are going to say things when you are faced with a new promotion or a new opportunity, and you start to feel like you internalize these feelings that say, oh my God, you know, am I going to be able to do it? You know, they're going to find out I'm not as smart as they thought they were. That I was. They're going to find out I'm not as experienced as they thought they was. They're going to find out that I'm not able to cut it. So what we do, we work like crazy. We over prepare. And we don't take the time to appreciate and embrace the success that we're feeling, because we're so concerned and so worried about failure and how others may be perceiving us. So I'm going to just give you just a couple of quick comments about that I have in the book about how strategies about how to address the imposter syndrome. Because one thing I will tell you, and it came out clearly to me, to Ed Whitaker, and everybody I spoke with, is it doesn't go away. That voice will find its way up every time you're faced, and it usually happens when you're faced with something really good, a new opportunity, a new position, something, and then that voice in your head will go off and make you question whether or not you're able to do whatever that thing is. So the first thing that I say in my book, in terms of conquering that voice, is to don't stay silent. That you need to find somebody that you trust, who know your ability, who knows what you've achieved, who knows your experiences, and basically they can talk you down. When you are faced with this new great opportunity and then you start to say, oh my God, you know, I don't think I can do this, they can help you see the things that you start to ignore about your own achievements. I did it actually. I wasn't even comfortable in talking to people about it. So the way I kind of started to what I call internally validate myself was by writing down my accomplishments, writing down what I had achieved, writing down the experiences that needed to be for this position. And then I'd read it and say to myself, why am I getting so crazy? This I ought to be able to do. There may be some pieces I've got to learn. Everybody's got to learn. But I've got the reason that I got this is because I've already shown that I can do this. So that's the other thing I tell people as they're thinking about in this imposter, that voice goes off, is to ask yourself this simple question. What did they, whoever the they is, whether it's the admissions person at the college, whether it's that new company that you're going into, whether it's that new boss you're looking at, ask this question of yourself, what did they use as evidence that I could do this? And that helps you start to internally validate yourself. And that's what people who know you and care about you and know your experience. So it can be a partner, it can be a coach, it can be somebody who, a good friend of yours, but they can help you see the things that you can't see. I talk about the fact that everybody has strengths and weaknesses. And so when you have the imposter syndrome, you're always thinking that everybody's got more than you have. They have more of this. They're smarter in this. Well, all of us have smarts in different ways. Nobody's perfect. You aren't, they aren't. So look at people in terms of the totality of who they are. I talk about internally validating yourself because with the imposter syndrome, we're constantly looking for that external validation that we're okay. So one of the things that you need to do is when you've done something and it's been successful and somebody says to you, that was outstanding, that was a great report, that was a great presentation, that was whatever, it was fantastic. And our knee-jerk reaction is always, because we fear that maybe we won't be able to repeat that success, we immediately start to discount it. So we say things like, oh, it wasn't a big deal. Oh, anybody could have done it. Oh, don't, it wasn't a big, I was just lucky. No, what I say in the book is stop. Listen to what people are saying to you. Say thank you and take it in. That's another piece of that internal validation that you can use when in fact the voice starts in your head. And as one of the things at the very end, I say, pay it forward. When Dr. Clance and Imes did the research, they said, when you learn to conquer the imposter syndrome, you're able to share your joy, your zest, and your power. So that's what I'm hoping to do. That's what I hope to do with the book. And that's the last message I want to leave you with. So I'm going to close then, and I think we've got about 12 minutes or so for questions. Not sure who's going to orchestrate it for us.
I couldn't get myself off mute. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thanks, Constance.
Thank you so much. So Mariela and I are going to tag team these questions. If folks have questions, please put them in the chat box, because we do have a lot of people and we want to make sure that we address them. So the first one I saw was from Lawrence, and Lawrence is the director of the CUNY 2X Tech Talent Pipeline at Lehman College. I'm going to summarize. He says that he journals every day to deal with imposter syndrome, and wonders what type of journaling styles did you use, Ms. Roche, if you did that at all, to help you sort of tackle what you were going through?
Well, I didn't journal every day, but I did use, as I said, my way of trying to get myself down, get off the roof in terms of dealing with this, was to write to myself. So I would just take a pad and a pen and write down exactly how I was feeling. I would write down the situation. I would write down, and I would be painfully honest with myself, something that I didn't feel comfortable actually saying to someone else. And I would write it down, and then I would read it. And basically I'd write down what I wrote, and I would say to myself, you know, that's crazy. Why are you feeling like that? You've already done this. So it was like having a conversation. So my method of journaling or writing to myself was to help me understand what this churn that was going on inside. So it was a feedback mechanism for me. But I did have, Lawrence, just one thing. I do have a story of another friend who was a senior executive at Pepsi, at Sears, etc. And she said, sort of like you, that when she'd leave the office, she'd sit in her car every day and write down what happened that day. And that became her way of dealing with what was going on internally and externally for her in terms of the imposter syndrome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Joyce. We have another question from Janine Jansen, and I'm just going to read what she wrote in the chat box. How do you strategize overcoming imposter syndrome and being authentic? I find it challenging to navigate being your true self and strategizing who you are for the room you are in. It can be exhausting to read a room and presenting your best self for success versus being your true authentic self, which we know can be a risk.
Yeah, very, very interesting and very good question. I met a woman when I was talking about my book, and she was doing a book called, I think it's called The Authentic Self, Canadian woman. And she did this dynamic, in her book, she talked about these 3 phases of how we function. And she said there is the performing self, there is the, what was it, performing, I'm going to say comfort self, and then there was the authentic self. And she said, all of us go into each one of those. It's hard to stay in your authentic self all the time, because your authentic self sometimes is not, I think it's accommodating or adapting self. It's not comfortable in certain situations. So she said, often we find ourselves in that adapted self, meaning that you're reading a room, you realize that this room maybe is more formal than you tend to be authentically, that this room requires a presentation style that maybe is not your normal style. You adapt, in a sense, that style. You adapt maybe more formality than is you, but you're doing it and consciously doing it and knowing that you are adapting because you want them to hear what you're saying. She said, the authentic self is great, but it's hard to stay there. She said, you never really want to be in the performing self, because the performing self means that you are ignoring everything about yourself and that you are compromising, in a sense, your values, etc., to fit in. So when you catch yourself in the performing self, that you are not only ignoring but you're denying who you really are, then get yourself out of there. Realize that the adaptive self is going to be the more commonplace, and comfort may be in the authentic self, but you can't stay down there a long time. So I use this analogy: when you go into someone's home and you look at the way they've decorated it, and you might say, oh my God, I never would have put that stuff together. Well, you don't tell the people, move that over here, move that, change those pictures, put this over here, do this, because it's not your home. So you adapt to that environment because it's someone else's home. It's not yours, it's not your taste, but you know that that's what, okay, this is their thing. But you never want to compromise your integrity, your values, etc., in the context of that. So yes, there are the places, but don't stay in the performance, because then performance says that I'm ignoring all of whom because not every environment in terms of embracing difference is going to embrace difference, but you can figure out a way to let your difference in the adapted self come in, because now you're reading the room. It's a formal room, but you're allowing your experience, which is a part of who you are, to come to bear on that particular discussion. So that's the difference between those three. And yes, it's great to think about authenticity, but authenticity sometimes is not just, especially in professional environment, may or may not be the one that you can stay in.
We have another question from Victoria Gray Pryor, and she wants to know, as she moves through a career transition and change, how does she fully utilize her very full, and it is very full, work experience and background and education, I'm going to add that in there, to validate her place at this new table? She's moving from work and education back to political and social work.
Well, I think that we have to always, we've got, all of that experience is probably going to come to bear in her new role. It's just been done in a different environment. And so what we often do, especially if we're looking at, that is not just that's a career change. That's not a position change. So those become even greater leaps for us. When I went from corporate to nonprofit, that was a career change for me. But there was a lot that I did in the corporate world that made complete sense and that I could use in this nonprofit world. But I had to learn parts of the nonprofit world. And what I mean by that is running this nonprofit was like running a business. They're not any different. You have employees, you have issues surrounding your constituencies, you have all of the things that you're doing. You're just doing it in a different environment. Marketing, I needed to be able to market Girls Inc. to the general public the way I marketed products when I was at Avon or Revlon or Carson. I needed to create things that would be, would work into the audience that I was targeting. Well, I needed to make Girls Inc. work for the audience that I was trying to get to be donors and supporters of the organization. But what I didn't know is I didn't know how to function in nonprofit. I didn't realize one thing, which is that you have so many fewer resources than you did in corporate. I needed to be much more hands-on. I needed to understand nonprofit accounting. Huge difference. For-profit accounting, nonprofit accounting, completely different worlds. And so I would say, is it Victoria? I'm sorry. That your educational background, there's going to be a lot as you move into this political space that's going to be applicable, because it's about influencing audiences, understanding different dynamics. How do you get them how do you teach them and help them move to where you want them to move to? But there will be things that you're going to have to learn that are particular to that new career. So bring what you bring and use what you're bringing. And that's what I had to understand is here's what I'm bringing that's of value. And it gives me the opportunity to be open to the part I need to learn. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. We have one more question from Britna Bennett. How does one navigate imposter syndrome when you have seen proof of racial or other forms of bias in your environment?
Well, that's what I meant by Dr. Clance's comment about sometimes it's not the imposter syndrome, sometimes it's your environment. And I am always honest with people that one, understand first, and I talk about this a little bit as one of the strategies, understand if this question and this feeling of self-doubt only happens when you are with a certain group in your company or with a certain individual within your company, or is it systemic, across the whole thing? If it's with that particular group or with that particular person, but it's a company that you think embraces you as an individual and you have the opportunity, then work to get yourself to a different place within that company and use as many allies as you can to help you do that. If it's systemic in the culture of the company, then what you need to do is start to work to get yourself out. Because there are, the culture within an environment will either be one that, as I was just talking on a board recently about the concept of diversity versus inclusion. Often diversity becomes a numbers game. And it says, I've got one of these and I got one of these and I got one of these, but I'm not going to change my culture to be able to take advantage. That I don't have a culture that is accepting of difference. I haven't gotten to the place that having these different kinds of experiences and these people with different backgrounds are going to make us better as an entity. That's what inclusion is. So sometimes you have to work to get yourself out if you realize that it's culture, not the imposter syndrome. And it's important to understand that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Constance and Mariela, for your partnership and your leadership on this event. I love how you tag team the questions, and thank you for all that you do in your communities. I want to thank everybody for their participation today, as well as for the comments, the good questions that helped us to go deeper into this discussion. But I especially want to thank you, Joyce, for today's talk, and more importantly, for being authentic and compassionate. I'm glad that Janine asked the question about authenticity, because I said in the beginning that my favorite thing about you is, the way that you interact with and treat others. And I appreciate that you've broken barriers for many of us that are following and brought us along in your success amidst all of the challenges that you have faced in your own career and still that we're facing. And this is a very timely conversation. Everybody's been commenting and just saying thank you for the opportunity and giving of yourself. And so I appreciate that you continue to create the spaces for us to have these critical discussions about self-development and leadership development. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful weekend. If you have follow-up questions or any questions that we were not able to get to, please feel free to reach out to myself, Constance, or Mariela, and we will make sure that Joyce gets those questions and that we get back to you. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Damari, and Constance and Mariela.
Thank you
Great,
so much.
great chat.